The history of ideas is a field of research in history that deals with the expression, preservation, and change of human ideas over time. The history of ideas is a sister discipline to, or a particular approach within, intellectual history. Work in the history of ideas may involve interdisciplinary research in the history of philosophy, the history of science, or the history of literature. In Sweden, the history of ideas and science has been a distinct university subject since the 6th of November 1932, when Johan Nordström, a scholar of literature, was appointed professor of the new discipline in a ceremony at Uppsala University. Today, several universities across the world provide courses in this field, usually as part of a graduate program. The Lovejoy approach. The historian Arthur O. Lovejoy coined the phrase history of ideas and initiated its systematic study in the early decades of the 20th century. Johns Hopkins University was a fertile cradle to Lovejoy's history of ideas. He worked there as a professor of history from 1910 to 1939, and for decades he presided over the regular meetings of the History of Ideas Club. Another outgrowth of his work is the Journal of the History of Ideas. Aside from his students and colleagues engaged in related projects, scholars such as Isaiah Berlin, Michel Foucault, Christopher Hill, J.G.A. Pocock, and others have continued to work in a spirit close to that with which Lovejoy pursued the history of ideas. The first chapter of Lovejoy's book, The Great Chain of Being, lays out a general overview of what he intended to be the program and scope of the study of the history of ideas. Unit Ideas. Lovejoy's history of ideas takes as its basic unit of analysis the unit idea, or the individual concept. These unit ideas work as the building blocks of the history of ideas, though they are relatively unchanged in themselves over the course of time. Unit ideas recombine in new patterns and gain expression in new forms in different historical eras. As Lovejoy saw it, the historian of ideas had the task of identifying such unit ideas and of describing the historical emergence and recession in new forms and combinations. The unit idea methodology, intended to extract the basic idea within any philosophical work and movement, also has certain defining principles. 1. Assumptions. 2. Dialectical motives. 3. Metaphysical pathos. And 4. Philosophical semantics. These different principles define the overarching philosophical movement within which Lovejoy argues one can find the unit idea, which can then be studied throughout the history of that idea. Modern work. Quentin Skinner criticizes Lovejoy's unit idea methodology, and he argues that such a reification of doctrines has negative consequences. He emphasizes sensitivity to the cultural context of the texts and ideas being analyzed. Skinner's own historical methodology is based on J. L. Osborne's theory of speech acts. Andreas Dorschel criticizes Skinner's restrictive approach to ideas through verbal language, and points out how ideas can materialize in non-linguistic media genres such as music and architecture. Another important development within the study of ideas has been within the academic discipline of intellectual history. The Harvard historian Peter Gordon explains that intellectual history, as opposed to the history of ideas practiced by Lovejoy, studies and deals with ideas within a broader context. Gordon further emphasizes that intellectual historians, as opposed to historians of ideas and philosophers, tend to be more relaxed about crossing the boundary between philosophical texts and non-philosophical contexts. The distinction between philosophy and non-philosophy as something that is itself historically conditioned rather than eternally fixed. Therefore, intellectual history, as a means of reproducing a historically valid interpretation of a philosophical argument, tends to implement a contextualist approach when studying ideas and broader philosophical movements. Foucault's approach. Michel Foucault rejects the idea of the traditional way historians go about writing, which is a narrative. He believed that most historians prefer to write about long periods of time instead of digging deeper into a more specific history. Foucault argues that historians should reveal historical descriptions through different perspectives. This is where he comes up with the term archaeology for his method of historical writing. His historical method differs from the traditional sense of historical writing and is divided up into 4 different ideas. The first is that archaeology seeks to define the history through philosophical means, which is to say the discourse between thought, representation, and themes. The second is that, in archaeology, the notion of discontinuity assumes a major role in the historical disciplines. The third idea is that archaeology does not seek to grasp the moment that history at which the individual and the social are inverted into one another. And finally, the fourth point is that archaeology does not seek the truth of history, rather it seeks the discourse in it.